Story 1. The Hospital Security Guard. I got this story from a security guard named Marcus who worked at a hospital in Ohio. He'd been doing night shifts for about 3 years when this happened, and it still gives him chills to this day. It was a Tuesday night in October, around 2:30 a.m. Marcus was doing his regular rounds through the hospital's east wing, which had been closed for renovations. The hallways were dark except for the emergency lighting, casting long shadows that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. As he walked past the old pediatric ward, he heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks. It was the sound of a music box, playing that slow, tinny melody you'd hear from an old children's toy. The thing is, this wing had been completely emptied weeks ago. There was nothing in those rooms but plastic sheets and construction equipment. Marcus pulled out his flashlight and slowly approached the door where the sound was coming from. Room 314. He remembered it clearly because that number would haunt him for months after. The music was definitely coming from inside, getting louder as he got closer. He reached for his radio to call it in, but all he got was static. The batteries were full. He checked them at the start of his shift. He pushed open the door, and the music stopped instantly. The room was empty, just like it should have been. Plastic sheets covered the floor, and there was a ladder in the corner. Nothing else. But the air in that room was freezing cold, and Marcus could see his breath forming clouds in front of him. The rest of the wing was normal temperature. He swept his flashlight across the room one more time and was about to leave when he saw it. In the dust on the floor, there were small footprints. Child-sized footprints. They led from the door to the center of the room, where they just stopped, like whoever made them had vanished into thin air. Marcus backed out of the room slowly, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. As he reached the hallway, the music box started playing again. This time, it was coming from the room next door. Then the next one, and the next. Soon, it sounded like dozens of music boxes were playing throughout the entire wing, all slightly out of sync with each other, creating this horrible, distorted melody. He ran. He didn't care about protocol or looking tough. He ran all the way back to the security office and locked the door behind him. When he checked the cameras for that wing, they showed nothing but empty hallways. The timestamp on the footage jumped from 2:29 to 2:45 a.m. 16 minutes of missing footage that IT could never explain. Marcus found out later from an older nurse that the pediatric ward had been closed after a fire in the 1980s. 7 children had died in room 314. They'd been trapped when the door jammed, and the smoke got them before firefighters could break through. The nurse said that every few years, guards would report strange things in that wing. Music, laughter, sometimes crying. But the hospital administration always dismissed it as pipes settling or wind through the vents. Marcus transferred to day shifts after that night. He never went back to the East Wing, and he made sure to warn every new guard about room 314. Some believed him, some didn't. But the ones who didn't usually changed their minds after their first solo patrol through that hallway. Story 2. The Gas Station Attendant. This happened to a woman named Sarah who worked the graveyard shift at a 24-hour gas station just off Highway 50 in Nevada. It's one of those isolated stations where you might not see another car for hours, especially between midnight and dawn. It was a Wednesday night in February, around 3 a.m. Sarah was behind the counter, fighting to stay awake by scrolling through her phone. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the coffee maker gurgled occasionally. Pretty typical night. Then she heard the bell above the door chime. She looked up, expecting to see a trucker or maybe someone on a long road trip, but there was no one there. The door was wide open, cold desert air rushing in, but the parking lot was empty. No car, no person, nothing. She figured it was the wind. It got pretty strong out there sometimes. She walked over and pulled the door shut, making sure it latched properly. But as she turned to walk back to the counter, the bell chimed again. The door was open. Again, nobody there. This time, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She closed the door and locked it, something she wasn't supposed to do while on shift. She stood there watching it for a moment, and that's when she saw them, wet footprints on the white tile floor. They led from the door straight to the candy aisle. Sarah grabbed the baseball bat they kept under the counter. Her hands were shaking as she slowly walked toward the candy aisle. She peeked around the corner, and her blood turned to ice. There was a man standing there, but something was very wrong with him. He was soaking wet, dripping water all over the floor, even though it hadn't rained in weeks. His clothes looked old, like they were from the 70s or 80s. But the worst part was his skin. It was pale blue, like someone who'd been in cold water for too long. He was just standing there, staring at the candy bars, not moving at all. Sarah cleared her throat and managed to say, "Sir, can I help you?" The man turned his head slowly toward her. His eyes were completely white, no pupils, no iris, just white. Water dripped from his hair, his clothes, pooling around his feet. He opened his mouth like he was trying to speak, but all that came out was this gurgling sound, like someone drowning. Sarah backed away, keeping the bat raised. The man took a step toward her, then another. Water kept dripping, but it wasn't clear water anymore. It was dark, murky, with things floating in it, algae, maybe, or something worse. She ran back to the counter and grabbed her phone to call 911. But when she looked back, the man was gone. The floor was completely dry. No footprints, no water, nothing. Even the door was closed and locked, just like she'd left it. Sarah was about to convince herself she'd dozed off and dreamed it when she noticed something. The security camera monitor showed someone standing in the candy aisle. She looked back, empty. On the monitor, there he was, that wet man, standing exactly where she'd seen him. She called her manager, said she was sick, and left right then. She didn't care if she got fired. As she drove away, she looked in her rearview mirror and saw him standing in the parking lot, watching her leave. The next day, she did some research. In 1983, a man named Jeffrey Walsh had driven off the road during a flash flood about 2 miles from the gas station. His car was swept into a ravine that filled with water. He'd drowned trying to get out. His body was found 3 days later. Sarah quit that job. She heard from a coworker that the next person who took graveyard shifts lasted exactly 1 night before refusing to come back. They'd seen a wet man in the candy aisle too. The gas station owner eventually had to close overnight because nobody would work those hours anymore. Story 3. The Warehouse Worker. Mike worked at a massive distribution warehouse in Illinois, the kind that's basically a small city of shelves and conveyor belts. He'd been on the night shift for 6 months, working from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., mostly alone except for 2 other guys who worked the opposite end of the building. This particular night in November, Mike was operating a forklift in Section G, which was at the very back of the warehouse. It was the oldest part of the building, with flickering lights and shelves that creaked even when there was no wind. Most workers avoided it when they could. Around 1 a.m., Mike was moving pallets when he heard his name being called. It was faint, like someone shouting from far away. He turned off the forklift and listened. There it was again. Mike. Mike. But it didn't sound like either of his co-workers. The voice was different, older somehow. He got off the forklift and walked toward where he thought the voice was coming from. The deeper he went into Section G, the colder it got. His breath started misting in front of him, which made no sense. The warehouse was climate controlled. The voice kept calling, leading him to the very back corner where they stored old equipment that hadn't been touched in years. As he rounded the last shelf, he saw someone standing there in a warehouse uniform. But the uniform was wrong. It was the old style they'd stopped using in the 90s. The man had his back turned to Mike. He was facing the wall, just standing there, completely still. Mike called out, "Hey, you okay?" The man didn't respond, didn't move. Mike stepped closer and reached out to tap the guy's shoulder. The moment his hand made contact, the man turned around, and Mike stumbled backward in horror. The man's face was crushed on one side, like something heavy had fallen on him. Blood, dried and dark, covered half his uniform. But his one good eye was looking right at Mike, and his mouth moved like he was trying to speak. Mike ran. He sprinted back to his forklift, started it up, and drove straight to the break room where his co-workers were. He was pale, sweating, barely able to speak. When he finally told them what happened, one of the older guys, Tom, went white as a sheet. Tom told him that in 1994, a worker named David Chen had been killed in Section G. A shelf had collapsed on him during the night shift. He'd called for help, but in that huge warehouse, nobody heard him. They found his body the next morning. The thing was, David had been working alone in that section, just like Mike always did. They all went back to Section G together, flashlights in hand. When they got to that back corner, they found something that made them all freeze. On the wall, written in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "Help me." Tom said those words hadn't been there before. He'd worked that section just last week. On the floor, in the dust, there were footprints. 2 sets, Mike's fresh ones, and another set that looked like they'd been there for years, leading right up to the wall where Mike had seen the figure. But that wasn't the worst part. Mike transferred to day shift immediately. But even on days, he'd sometimes hear about night shift workers reporting strange things in Section G. Voices calling their names, shadows moving between the shelves, and sometimes, just sometimes, the sound of a shelf creaking and falling, followed by a scream that echoed through the entire warehouse. The company eventually stopped assigning people to Section G during night shifts. They said it was for efficiency reasons, but everyone knew the truth. That corner of the warehouse belonged to David Chen now, and he was still trying to call for help, decades after it was too late. Story 4. The Hotel Night Auditor. Rachel worked as a night auditor at an old hotel in Maine, one of those historic places that had been around since the 1920s. The hotel had been renovated several times, but it still had that old building feel, creaking floors, drafty hallways, and an elevator that groaned like it was in pain. Her shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and most nights were quiet. She'd do the books, check in the occasional late arrival, and watch Netflix on her laptop. But this night in January was different from the moment she clocked in. It started when she was doing her first walkthrough at midnight. The hotel had 4 floors, and she always checked each one to make sure everything was secure. When she got to the 3rd floor, she noticed that room 333 had its door slightly open. According to her computer, that room was vacant. It had been vacant for months, actually. The hotel never rented it out anymore, though nobody would tell her why. She approached the door carefully and pushed it open. The room was dark, but there was this smell, like old flowers, roses maybe, but sickly sweet like they'd been rotting. She flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulbs were all broken, glass scattered on the carpet. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw someone sitting in the chair by the window. It was a woman in an old-style dress, maybe from the 1950s. She was facing the window, completely motionless. Rachel's heart was pounding as she said, "Ma'am, this room is closed. You can't be in here." The woman turned her head slowly. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were solid black. No whites, no color, just black. She smiled, and when she did, Rachel could see that her teeth were stained red. The woman stood up, and as she did, Rachel heard the sound of water dripping. Looking down, she saw water pooling around the woman's feet, spreading across the carpet. Rachel backed out of the room and slammed the door shut. She ran to the elevator, frantically pressing the button. Behind her, she could hear footsteps, wet footsteps, coming down the hallway. The elevator finally arrived, and she jumped in, pressing the lobby button over and over. When she got back to the front desk, she called her manager at home. He sighed when she told him about room 333 and said he'd be right there. While she waited, she looked up the room's history in the hotel's old records. In 1953, a woman named Elizabeth Morse had drowned in the bathtub of room 333. Her husband had found her when he returned from a business trip. The strange thing was, she'd been in the tub fully dressed in her evening gown, and the water was full of rose petals. The death was ruled a suicide, but there were rumors that her husband had killed her after discovering an affair. When her manager arrived, they went up to the 3rd floor together. The door to room 333 was closed and locked, just like it should have been. He opened it with his master key, and the room was normal, dusty from disuse, but normal. No broken lights, no water on the floor, no smell of roses. But then Rachel noticed something that made her skin crawl. On the mirror in the bathroom, written in condensation like someone had breathed on it, were the words, "He did it." Her manager quickly wiped the mirror clean and told Rachel to never mention this to anyone. He said Elizabeth appeared every few months, always to the night staff, always trying to tell her story. The hotel kept the room closed, but somehow, she kept finding ways to make herself known. Rachel finished her shift, but she never forgot that night. She worked there for another month before finding a day job. On her last night, as she was doing her final walkthrough, she passed room 333 one more time. The door was closed, but she could hear water running inside. She didn't investigate. Some things are better left alone. But as she walked away, she heard a whisper, clear as day, "Thank you for listening." The next morning, the day manager found every mirror in the hotel fogged up with condensation. On each one, written in elegant script, was a single name, William Morse. Elizabeth's husband. The man who might have gotten away with murder. Those are the 4 stories from the graveyard shift. Each one reported by real people who were just trying to make a living, working through the lonely hours when most of the world is asleep. They didn't ask for these encounters, didn't go looking for the paranormal. It found them in those quiet hours when the boundary between our world and something else seems to grow thin. Which story scared you the most? Comment below and subscribe for more true horror stories.